Hello, my name is Carl Zangerl. My colleague, Dr. Ed Powers, and I will be going over essentially kind of an overview of crisis communication in Module 1 of this on-demand program. And maybe a good way to start, Ed, is, what is a crisis? How do we define the term?
A crisis, Carl, is sort of one of those things. What's the old definition? I'll know it when I see it. But from an academic perspective and from experts who have studied this for a long period of time, there are typically three elements. One, there's a negative occurrence, and that can be anything from a product recall to an explosion at a factory, to an executive who commits fraud, to a virus that causes a pandemic. So that's a negative event, but the other two pieces have to be associated with it. One is that it deals with stakeholder perception. How do people react to the negative event? So in some cases, say for instance, a company closes a factory locally. In some cases, that may be a huge deal to the community. It may disrupt the whole economy. In another community, it may be no big deal because the economy is so robust. So in one case, the company's got a crisis. In the other case, it doesn't. Which leads to the third element after perception, which is action and behavior by the stakeholders. Stakeholders typically at a minimum will monitor what's going on with a crisis. But when the antenna really goes up and they start to pay really close attention, you start to see things like inquiries into what's going on, what are you doing? And potentially comments to the media about they're concerned about the issue, they're upset about the issue. And that's when a crisis is full blown, where you have the combination of the negative occurrence, the stakeholder reaction of there's concern, and then finally at least some form of action by the stakeholders. That's when it all comes together as a full blown crisis.
So we have a crisis situation on our hands. How would you kind of categorize the impacts of a crisis situation?
The impacts of crisis usually fall into two categories. One is the immediate impact, the short term. So that includes things like people getting hurt or killed. It includes things like financial impacts, sales plummeting, stock prices dropping. It can include property being destroyed through fire or explosion. It can include environmental damage, things we can see right away. Then the second form of impact is longer term. Typically as the crisis subsides and life starts to return to normal, there's the impact, for instance, on the company's reputation, the organization's reputation. How did it do? How are people feeling about that organization now that the crisis is over? And that in turn can lead to other impacts, such as if the reputation has taken a hit, there may be higher turnover in terms of your employees. There may be a rise in the number of lawsuits being filed against the company, and other similar types of actions where people are demonstrating that they've lost confidence in the organization.
So you're really making the case that there is a correlation, can be a very strong correlation between how an organization responds to a crisis and their reputation, their brand image in the marketplace. You really feel there's a strong connection there?
Very much so, Carl. It's in two important ways. One is the reputation going into the crisis. So an organization that has a good, solid reputation is known as a good place to work, a quality organization that provides good products, good services, is going to get the benefit of the doubt going into the crisis. Conversely, the organization that's viewed as sketchy or this uncertainty around it, or it's had past negative events, is not going to get that benefit of the doubt. So their challenge is going to be that much harder in dealing with the crisis. That's part one. Part two is at the back end of the crisis. Once it's over, reputation needs to be measured again. How did the organization do and how did it come through the crisis? And it's absolutely true. There are many cases in the literature to prove this, that organizations have seen their reputations be harmed by how they responded, or in many cases chose not to respond to a crisis. At the same time, I should point out that a company can come through quite well through a crisis. It can maintain a strong reputation, and in some cases, they can actually come through with an enhanced reputation. The Johnson & Johnson case from the back in the 80s with Tylenol, where they did the right thing by the public, is probably the classic example of how a company actually bolstered its reputation despite a devastating crisis.
Yeah, I think the Tylenol case is one of those classic examples, and always drives home the point that communication words need to be followed up by actions. That simply issuing a stream of messages isn't going to really be an adequate response to a crisis, and will not sort of magically restore a reputation. There has to be action that really gives substance to the words. And when I think, here's another thing I often hear, and that is, gee, you can't prepare for crises because they're unpredictable. Who knows when an earthquake's going to happen? Who knows when a pandemic is going to happen? Is that fair, or is it really more a matter that we can't necessarily predict the timing of some crises? I mean, what's your take on this?
I think you're right, Carl. It's more a case of timing, and so it's true relative to things being unpredictable. If you or I were holding this conversation in the fall of 2019, we probably wouldn't be talking about what is the prospect of a pandemic hitting not just the United States, but globally. It just wouldn't be in our everyday discussion at that point in time. Yet nonetheless, here we are today. So while you can't necessarily predict a crisis, you can anticipate a crisis. And typically the experts in the field, what they recommend is don't try and predict the crisis, try and anticipate the impact. So for instance, it is a great exercise to think through, what if your employees couldn't get to work this week? What if your customers, for whatever reason, stop buying from you this week? What if your suppliers all of a sudden had an issue and they couldn't supply you? Things of that sort form a good exercise, because they're not tied to how did we get here, but rather you're in the situation. Now, what are you going to do? And in the same way, the aspect of communications comes into play. From a communications point of view, you can think about 4 things in advance, even before any crisis hits. One is, how would you be organized? So for instance, you don't want to have, on day one of a crisis, you don't want to have your first planning meeting of, who's our spokesperson going to be? Who's going to work with management to find out what actions are going to be taken? Who's going to run social media? You want to have had those discussions ahead of time. In a similar way, you want to have thought about, who are our key stakeholders? Who would we need to communicate with? What ways will we communicate with them? What channels? Do those channels already exist? Are they humming along nicely? And then finally, what kinds of messages would we be wanting to convey to them? What would they be needing to hear from us? Those can all be anticipated and can be discussed ahead of time.
Yeah, and I recall, and I totally agree with you, that and thinking about a crisis, preparing for a crisis, is really a wonderful opportunity to engage a cross-functional team within an organization. You can't assume that just the public relations person or department has responsibility for this. A crisis typically affects everybody in the organization, and some functional areas more than others. It's a great opportunity in planning for a crisis situation or situations to really engage people from across the organization, to be thinking about it, to be aware of what the organization as a whole will need to do. And absolutely on the money in terms of who are spokespeople going to be in particular situations. You have to make that decision very, very fast, which kind of brings me to the point of, if you were to suggest 3 kind of guiding principles to latch onto for all of our listeners, what would those three guiding principles be?
Carl, as I think about the environment we're in now with coronavirus and how disruptive it's been, three guiding principles come to mind. The first one is one that makes the list of key actions on any list, any crisis communications list, which is to respond quickly. And this is easier said than done for a couple reasons. One is, for most organizations, there's a procedure before something gets communicated. There's some form of creation and review before information goes out to different groups, whether employees or customers or whomever. That goes away in a crisis. You got to be able to respond quickly, and that can be hard for organizations. Similarly, in a crisis, there's the aspect of information can be scarce. You don't know all the answers. A great example from the current situation, here we are several weeks into the coronavirus crisis, and people, very smart people, are still discussing whether or not we should be wearing masks or not. Are they beneficial or not beneficial? That's typical of what happens in any crisis situation. Information is not always crystal clear. So that can make it hard, but an organization has to overcome those obstacles to respond quickly and regularly. Rule number one, or principle number one. Principle number two is what I call demonstrating the right values. And probably the best way to describe this is with an example. This is a sort of a classic crisis communication case from several years ago involving Ford, the car company, and Firestone, the tire company. So there were quite a few accidents involving blowouts on Ford cars with Firestone tires. The two companies spent months and actually years sort of finger pointing at each other as it's your fault, no, it's your fault. Lawsuits were filed and the like. They completely lost track of what was key here was the fact that people who own Ford cars and driving on Firestone tires were being killed in some cases and maimed in other cases, severely hurt. You need to demonstrate the right values and have the right focus. Principle number three relates to what I call the three key needs. And this exists for virtually any crisis. The first one is you got to solve the problem. And I'll illustrate this with an example. Back a few years ago, BP, the oil company, found itself in the midst of a huge crisis in the Gulf of Mexico. One of its oil rigs exploded, and there was oil leaking day after day into the Gulf of Mexico. And in fact, the TV news was showing that regularly as that oil seeped into the ocean. And so they had to solve that problem first. You have to demonstrate that, yes, you can get the situation under control. Second key need is you have to take care of victims. So staying with this BP example, the victims included small businesses that had a shutter because nobody was coming to their restaurants and to their shops. It included the environmental impact. We saw many pictures of wildlife just covered in tar and oil. And that had to be addressed relative to, they're also victims, wildlife victims. So that's the second key need. The third key need is, how are you going to prevent something like this from ever happening again? And this isn't necessarily a day one thing to address, but it's important that an organization recognize that, yes, it did happen, but we are going to take steps to make sure it doesn't happen again.
You know, those three key principles, we're seeing them in action, of course, every day during the current global crisis. We're seeing so many organizations. How quickly are they responding? Are their responses reflective of their values? And are they really going to the sort of immediate needs? I mean, a couple of examples come to my mind. Zoom, you know, incredibly popular virtual communication platform, and yet discovery of flaws, security flaws. CEO needs to jump in right away and address that situation almost instantaneously, because any delay would be disastrous. And then I'm thinking of a company like Uber that is trying to project its values by, offering free rides to healthcare workers or delivering food to senior citizens. We can see this play out in many, many different ways. And taken together, the degree to which an organization really kind of meets those guiding principles, really acts on those guiding principles, determines how effective their crisis communication response is going to be and the long-term impact on their image and their reputation. So, as we're going to drill deeper into this whole subject of crisis communication, but, in this module, Ed, could you just briefly describe what our listeners are going to be delving into and really want them to, those of you watching this, engage with the material, really see, gee, what does it trigger in my mind? How would I respond to this situation? So Ed, tell us a little bit about what our watchers here can dig into and engage in a little bit more depth.
Sure, absolutely, Carl. So first of all, there is a slide deck with notes that goes into more detail on the same topics we've been discussing here, ranging from what constitutes a crisis all the way to guiding principles. So that's item number one. Secondly, we have included a couple of articles that we are of interest and tie back again to these topics. One is topical. It's about principles of leading an organization through this current coronavirus crisis. And the other is on a topic I often refer to, as do others in crisis communication, as the undiscussables. There's a truism that they're always typically precursors to an actual crisis, that there are signals that either were missed or were consciously acknowledged but viewed as not a big enough deal. And so what happens when people see these things and choose not to speak up? Why do they not choose to speak up? And what happens when they sort of just lay dormant? That's what this article discusses. We also are going to include a case study. We're going to try and include one case study in each of the modules. In this first module, we're including one on Domino's Pizza from a few years ago. The situation is that Domino's Pizza had a couple of employees who essentially went rogue on social media. They did some disgusting things with food that was being shipped to a customer, home delivery to a customer, and they recorded the whole thing and put it up on social media, which immediately took off, as you might guess. And so the case study looks at how Domino's responded, what they did well in responding to it, and how they tried to do it, and what they did not do so well. So it's an interesting case study. And then finally, as in each of the modules, there'll be just a short quiz to review some of the key concepts. And this ties back into the idea of ultimately earning a digital badge from having taken this mini course through the Office of Alumni Relations.
Yeah, we absolutely encourage people watching this on-demand program to, again, delve into the material. It's not too heavy, and to really think about it. Think about how it relates to their organization, their own perception of crisis situations. And, the little quiz at the end, as you say, Ed, at the end of the 3 modules, if they're all completed, there is a digital badge that just indicates that the person has spent time thinking about these topics. For module 2, just to set that up a little bit, we're really going to talk a lot about stakeholder analysis, stakeholders. Stakeholders is maybe kind of a fancy term for groups of people. And really in any crisis communication situation, we need to always think about the people who are being affected, the people who will respond to that situation in a whole range of different ways. And so we're going to focus on stakeholders in that next module. And I hope all of you watching this now will join us in that exploration. Thank you.